Pocket of mist and murk, surrounded by forested hills that seemed to lean in on the buildings with each passing season. Trees in Elder Grove were old, ancient, really twisted in impossible angles as though shaped by invisible hands. Locals said the forests had never fully been mapped, that something about the woods shifted subtly each year, swallowing paths, altering landmarks, making sure outsiders rarely ventured into them twice. It was here that Lena Ashford arrived on the last, nearly forgotten bus from the city. Her footfalls echoed on the wet cobblestones as she stepped down, adjusting her dark wool coat against the biting chill. Her breath formed faint clouds in the air, swirling into the deepening fog that drifted like fingers around the buildings. The evening settled around her with a weight, thick and watchful, and Lena could feel the silence press against her ears. Elder Grove's main street was deserted. Pale, golden street lamps lined the narrow road, their light flickering and casting uneven shadows. The storefronts were dark, with closed signs on most windows, and not a soul was out despite the early evening hour. Through the misted glass of nearby shops, Lena thought she caught glimpses of eyes peering out, as if the townsfolk had sensed her arrival. She ignored them. She was used to the look strangers gave her, long, uncertain, as if they saw in her something she tried hard to bury. Lena glanced down the narrow street, searching for the inn where she planned to stay. The bus driver had pointed her to it, a rough-looking building called the Drowned Lantern. Though his words had been few and clipped, he hadn't offered any details, just the name, his voice low and wary, as though the town itself might overhear. As she walked, she caught the scent of damp earth and mildew, the faint metallic tang of stagnant water lingering in the air. The chill wrapped around her, sinking through her clothes, seeping down to her bones. Elder Grove didn't just feel cold, it felt ancient, as though it held memories deeper than stone or soil, and Lena could sense the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. At the end of the street, the inn came into view. It was a modest, two-story structure with sagging eaves and warped wooden shutters. Its windows glowed with dim light, but somehow it still seemed cloaked in shadow, half lost in the fog. A sign swung above the door, weathered and nearly unreadable, creaking softly as the wind nudged it back and forth. Lena pushed open the door, and the sound echoed through the small lobby. The interior was sparse, with a handful of mismatched chairs and tables arranged around a central fireplace, where a low fire crackled. A woman with steel-gray hair and hard, narrow eyes looked up from behind a counter, her gaze sweeping over Lena with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Evening," the innkeeper greeted, her voice edged with caution. "Not many visitors this time of year. I prefer the quiet," Lena replied, offering a polite smile. The woman's eyes flickered to Lena's hand as she passed over a few folded bills for the room. A hand marked by a faint scar that curled around her thumb, an old injury she often forgot about until someone noticed it. The innkeeper took the money, then handed Lena a tarnished brass key. "Rooms upstairs," the woman said, jerking her chin toward a narrow staircase in the corner. "Second door on the left. There's tea and bread by the fire if you need it." "Thank you," Lena replied, pocketing the key and heading upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit, the old floorboards creaking under her steps. She found her room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window that overlooked the street below. She set her bag on the bed, then walked to the window, wiping a thin layer of mist from the glass to peer outside. The fog had thickened, rolling in waves down the street like some living thing, curling around the lampposts and buildings, casting shadows that seemed to shift and dance. Lena leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as something caught her attention. A dark figure at the edge of the fog, standing perfectly still beneath a broken street lamp. The figure was tall, its form draped in darkness as though it wore the fog itself as a cloak. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine, her skin prickling as she stared, but she didn't look away. The figure's outline was strange, blurring at the edges, and though she could barely make out its shape, she had the distinct sense that it was watching her too. The feeling was intense, almost physical, as though a pair of eyes were boring into her. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure faded, merging with the shadows until it was gone, leaving only an unsettling emptiness in its place. Lena exhaled slowly, her heart racing despite her steady gaze. She'd seen things before, glimpses of shadows, fleeting forms in darkened rooms, but this felt different, more solid. This wasn't a trick of the mind. It was something real, something old and dangerous. She pulled the curtains closed, her mind racing. Stories she'd heard long ago came to the surface. Tales of the shadow, a figure whispered about in low voices, said to be a spirit or something darker, that roamed the outskirts of towns like Elder Grove. She hadn't believed the stories, not until now. Lena took a steadying breath and looked down at her hand, at the scar that lay there, a mark she'd carried since childhood. She could feel it tingling, as though the memory it held was trying to surface. She forced herself to ignore it. She hadn't come here for ghosts or shadows. She'd come here to find answers. After setting her things aside, Lena lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, where shadows played across the plaster in strange, undulating patterns. The town was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy and suffocating, pressing down like a weight. Just as she began to drift into sleep, she heard it, a faint whisper, just outside her window, a sound like the wind, but not quite. It was soft, almost inaudible, a voice calling out, just at the edge of her hearing. Her eyes flew open, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't move, listening as the whisper faded, swallowed by the night. Outside, the figure watched, hidden deep within the fog, waiting. Sleep did not come easily to Lena that night. Every time her eyes drifted shut, the faint sound of that whisper returned, growing louder, pressing into her mind like a persistent echo. The memory of the shadowed figure lingered behind her eyelids. Its dark silhouette burned into her thoughts. When she finally did sleep, it was fitful, haunted by dreams of twisted trees, unseen eyes, and dark fog that reached for her with clawed fingers. At dawn, Lena rose, her body heavy from restless sleep. Pale light filtered through the mist outside, casting a cold glow over her room. She dressed quickly, tugging on a worn sweater and pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders. She knew she wouldn't find peace lying in bed. Whatever had brought her to Elder Grove felt closer now, as if the town itself was nudging her, urging her to explore. Downstairs, the inn's small lobby was quiet. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, but a pot of tea sat steaming on a low table beside the fireplace. Grateful for the warmth, Lena poured herself a cup, feeling its heat seep into her fingers. She sipped in silence, her thoughts churning with questions. The figure she'd seen last night, the whisper, the stories she'd heard in her youth. All of it tangled together in a way that felt too intentional to ignore. Just as she finished her tea, she heard the floorboards creak, and the innkeeper emerged from a back room, her eyes settling on Lena with a hint of surprise. "Awake early, aren't you?" the woman asked, folding her arms as she observed Lena. Her gaze was guarded, as if she already suspected why Lena was here. "Couldn't sleep," Lena replied, keeping her tone light. She didn't want to reveal too much, not yet. "Thought I'd take a walk. Clear my head." The innkeeper gave a small, grim nod, her expression unreadable. "If you're planning to walk around Elder Grove, best stick to the main streets," she said, her voice dropping to a murmur. "Fog's thicker in the woods. People tend to lose their way." Lena met the woman's eyes, sensing the caution there, but also something else. Fear, buried deep but unmistakable. "Thank you for the advice," she said, though her decision was already made. She would go into the woods, no matter the warnings. If she'd come all this way, she couldn't afford to let fear hold her back. The innkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could read Lena's resolve, but she said nothing more, only retreating back into the shadows of the inn, leaving Lena alone once again. Outside, the air was damp and cold, the fog still clinging to the town like a gray veil. Lena wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she made her way down the empty street, her footsteps echoing off the silent buildings. The early morning quiet was thick and unnatural, as if even the birds dared not break the stillness. Her path led her past old storefronts, their windows clouded with dust, and abandoned homes with boarded-up doors. Elder Grove was a town forgotten by time, left behind by a world that no longer needed it. But something about that suited Lena just fine. She knew what it was like to be haunted by the past, to carry the weight of secrets too heavy to share. Finally, she reached the edge of town, where the forest loomed like a dark wall, its trees stretching high and tangled, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The air grew colder as she stepped off the cobblestone path and onto the forest trail, the fog thickening with each step, swallowing the town behind her. The deeper she ventured, the quieter it became, as though the forest absorbed all sound. Even her footsteps softened, muffled by the damp ground. Around her, shadows played among the trees, and every so often, she caught the faintest hint of movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Lena's pulse quickened, but she kept moving forward. She had come for a reason, a purpose she could barely admit to herself, a secret she carried from a past she had tried to leave behind. Her family had once lived in Elder Grove generations ago. Her grandmother, in particular, had spoken of the town as a place touched by darkness, where the shadow roamed. Lena had heard stories of children disappearing, of strange sightings in the woods, of whispers that haunted the night. But she hadn't believed any of it, not until the strange dreams began. Then she saw it, a clearing ahead where the fog thinned, revealing a small stone structure, half buried by earth and creeping vines. It looked ancient, its surface cracked and worn, as though it had been there longer than the trees themselves. A shiver ran down her spine as she approached, feeling a pull that she couldn't explain. The structure was circular, built from rough-hewn stones, with a low doorway that led into darkness. Lena hesitated at the entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. The air here was colder, charged with an energy that prickled her skin. She could feel it, a presence, watching her from within the shadows. Taking a steadying breath, Lena stepped inside. The darkness closed around her, thick and suffocating, pressing down like a weight. She let her eyes adjust, scanning the interior. The floor was covered in dirt and fallen leaves, but something glimmered faintly at the center of the room. She knelt down, brushing away the debris, and froze as her fingers touched cold metal. It was a locket, tarnished and ancient, with a strange symbol etched into its surface, a spiral that twisted inward, pulling her gaze as though it could draw her into itself. As she held it in her hand, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled, her vision blurring. She could hear something now, a faint whisper, as if the stone walls themselves were murmuring secrets. "You came back." The voice was soft, almost a sigh, and it seemed to echo from all around her. Lena's hand tightened around the locket, her heart racing. The voice was familiar, a voice she hadn't heard since she was a child. She tried to shake off the feeling, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. "You came back." Lena, her name echoed in the darkness, chilling her to the core. She stumbled backward, out of the stone structure, gasping for air as she broke free of the suffocating shadows. The forest loomed around her, silent and watchful, and for a moment, she thought she saw the dark figure again, standing just beyond the trees, half hidden by fog. But before she could move, it was gone, vanishing like smoke. Lena clutched the locket to her chest, feeling its cold metal press against her skin. Whatever she had just encountered, it was not something natural. It was something that belonged to this place, something tied to her past, and she knew now that it wouldn't let her leave so easily. As she made her way back to town, her mind spun with questions. The whisper, the figure, the locket, they were all connected, bound to a mystery that went far deeper than she'd realized. But one thing was clear. The shadow had found her, and Elder Grove's secrets were beginning to unravel. Lena returned to the inn as dawn broke, her hands still cold from clutching the locket. She slipped it into her pocket, feeling its weight like a hidden secret. Inside the inn, the warmth of the low fire didn't reach her. She felt that lingering chill that only Elder Grove seemed to possess. Taking a seat by the hearth, she stared into the flames, trying to gather her thoughts. But the morning offered no clarity, only a creeping sense that she was being watched, that whatever had called her name in the forest was still listening. Just then, the innkeeper appeared, carrying a tray of tea and a plate of bread. Her gaze landed on Lena's pale face, and she paused, her expression softening ever so slightly. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the innkeeper said, her tone cautious. Lena gave a small, bitter smile. "Maybe I have." The innkeeper said nothing at first, just poured a cup of tea and handed it to her. "Elder Grove has shadows," she murmured, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Best to leave them be, miss. The fog has a way of swallowing those who get too curious." Lena's eyes narrowed slightly. "The shadow, do you know what it is?" The innkeeper looked away, her gaze distant. "I know enough to tell you to leave it alone. People see things they don't understand in these woods. Some go looking for answers, and they don't come back the same, or don't come back at all." "What about you?" Lena pressed, sensing the innkeeper knew more than she was willing to share. "Have you seen it?" The woman's mouth tightened, and her eyes grew dark, troubled. "Not for many years, but once, yes." She paused, as though weighing her words. "I was a girl, not much younger than you are now. One night, my little brother went into the woods. No one knows why, but he was never the same after he came back." Her voice dropped to a whisper. It's as if a part of him stayed lost in that fog. Lena felt a pang of sympathy. She'd known the feeling of losing someone to something she couldn't understand. "I'm sorry." The innkeeper's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "I learned my lesson, miss. Best to leave the dead in peace." But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't just any spirit or ghost. It was tied to her family's past, to the strange pull that had led her here in the first place. She decided not to press the innkeeper further and instead returned to her room, determined to learn more on her own. Later that day, Lena wandered through the town, hoping to find someone who might know more. The townsfolk gave her wary glances, their eyes flicking to her and then away, as though they could sense she was not just a visitor, but someone tied to Elder Grove in ways they didn't want to acknowledge. At the edge of town, she came across a small bookshop, its sign half hidden beneath ivy. The shop felt abandoned, almost forgotten, but when she pushed open the door, the faint scent of dust and old paper greeted her. Inside, a man sat behind a wooden counter, hunched over a thick, leather-bound book. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. He was older, with hair graying at the temples and deep-set wrinkles around his mouth and eyes. Something in his gaze told her he had lived in Elder Grove all his life. "Not many visitors these days," he said, his voice rough and raspy. "I'm just passing through," Lena replied, though even she didn't fully believe it. She hesitated, then added, "I was hoping you might have something historical on Elder Grove. Legends, old records, anything that might explain." She trailed off, not sure how to phrase it. "Ah," the man said with a knowing nod. "The stories, then? You're not the first to ask, but few ever want to hear the answers." "Maybe I do," Lena replied firmly, meeting his gaze. The man studied her for a moment, then rose slowly, leading her to a small, dusty shelf at the back of the shop. He pulled down a thick, worn book bound in faded leather, its edges frayed and pages yellowed with age. The title was embossed in gold, though the letters had faded almost beyond recognition. The Shadows of Elder Grove. "This book holds what the town remembers, and what it tries to forget," he said, handing it to her. "Read carefully. Some things are better left buried." Lena took the book, her heart racing as she opened it. Inside, she found accounts of strange events dating back generations. Stories of a shadow that appeared in the woods, marking those it chose, and of people who vanished without a trace. She read of a family, the Ashfords, whose name appeared repeatedly in the pages, linked to the shadow in ways that were both vague and unsettling. They were described as guardians of something called the Veil, though the book didn't explain what that meant. "Why does it mention the Ashfords?" she asked, looking up at the man. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Your family's always had ties to this town, but what those ties are, only you can find that out." Lena could feel the weight of the man's words, and as she closed the book, she felt a strange connection to the pages, as if they held answers she wasn't yet ready to face. She thanked him and left, clutching the book tightly as she made her way back to the inn, her mind swirling with questions. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the locket cold against her chest. Her thoughts drifted to the figure she had seen in the fog, the voice that had whispered her name, the secrets her family seemed to hold. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. Eventually, she couldn't stand the stillness any longer. She grabbed the book and slipped downstairs, heading out into the fog-drenched streets. She walked aimlessly, letting her feet carry her, her mind lost in thought. Then, she heard it, a faint whisper calling her name, floating through the fog. It was the same voice she had heard in the forest, the same voice that had haunted her dreams. She stopped, her heart pounding, as the whisper grew louder, closer. "Lena," she turned slowly, and there it was, the shadow, standing at the edge of the fog, watching her with an intensity that pierced the mist. This time, it didn't vanish. It stayed, its form dark and blurred, almost human but not quite. Lena took a step forward, her fear overridden by a strange, powerful curiosity. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment, she thought she saw a pair of eyes, dark and endless, filled with a sorrow that sent a chill down her spine. The shadow lifted an arm, pointing back toward the forest, beckoning her. Lena felt the pull, a deep, insistent urge to follow. But she forced herself to stay rooted, clenching the locket in her hand. The figure held her gaze, as though pleading with her to understand, to see beyond what was in front of her. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow faded, melting into the fog until there was nothing left but silence. Lena stood alone in the empty street, her heart racing, her mind whirling with questions. She knew now that whatever haunted Elder Grove was tied to her family's past, to secrets buried long ago. And she knew she had to follow the shadow, even if it led her into the heart of darkness. End of chapter 3, but the story is far from over. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to complete the story.